Hello everybody, this is Jimmy Beach with Exposure Software. In today's demonstration, we're going to see how to take control of image colors in Exposure. Feel free to ask any questions during the demonstration, especially if it's related to what we're demonstrating. And as we get into, I'm monitoring the chat as we go. If the questions are not answered, during the presentation, we will make sure and handle them in the Q&A at the end. Exposure X6 is the latest version of our advanced non-destructive raw photo editor and organizer. It handles our full post-processing workflow, even though we're only using a small subset of the features in today's presentation. We have a lot of content over on our website that you could use to get more information about any of the things that we touch on today. Exposure has been around for about 15 years now. It started out as a plug-in to help film photographers with their transition from working in the darkroom with chemistry to editing on the computer. So it was really the accurate film emulation presets and exposure that connected with film photographers the most. It connected with them on a creative level, if you will. And since then, Exposure has grown into the software that it is today. So we're going to be discussing color and particularly controlling color in Exposure on images. So we'll take a look at some images here. I'll just go right up to a folder of shots. Here we go. So these are all really nice. I have a couple of these picked out that we can take a look at. Some of them have been processed. These ones here, you can see them. And then some of them have not. So this one's an unprocessed, and this is an unprocessed shot. You can see that difference pretty quick and pretty easy. But I did want to point out a couple of things here. So where we begin in the process of doing this, is we go for setting our white balance. Okay, so let's grab a shot here. I'm going to double click. Okay, let's open up our controls here on the right side. So we're going to open up the basic panel. So the basic panel, if you've ever watched any of our videos or watched any of the webinars before, usually the basic panel is where I would make the suggestion to begin the process or all of your processing in Exposure. So proper white balance for the image is usually the start of it. So at the beginning of at the top of our panel here, we can see we have the color and the black and white mode. This is about colors, so we're going to stay right there. And then we have our temp and our tint sliders, which control the white balance setting and the eyedropper. Okay, so this is what we're going to use. So you can make adjustments to these sliders one at a time to adjust the white balance of the photo. Or you can use the eyedropper to automatically set it. Okay, so in Exposure, I'm going to zoom in here. There's a couple of spots with white that I want to point out in the image. When you're making a sample with the eyedropper tool, you want to pick a neutral target. Now, a neutral target is a white. That's a natural white. So natural white would typically be the eyeballs. So I'm going to hover over the eyeballs and the whites of the eyes. And as I hover, you can see that Exposure updates very subtly as I drag around inside of that space. Now, the sample that we're taking right here is a 5x5 pixel grid. So if you sample a smaller area than 5x5, it would typically skew the results. So a 5x5 grid is what we found to be very nice for making balanced white balance settings or balance white balance adjustments. Another place that you can set the white balance would be down on the teeth, but teeth typically have a little bit of a yellow tone. Not making any judgments towards anyone's teeth, but you can see that if I do hover over here, her skin looks a little bit bluer, which means there's a little bit of yellow in this tone. Also, I want to point out that up here in the specular highlight area on the face where it's a little bit hot, hot means that it's very white. It's close to being clipped. It actually, if you look over on the right side, over here at the temp and tint sliders, if I hover over this highlight here, you can see that it doesn't actually apply any settings to the temp or tint sliders. What that means, I'm going to click here, is that the selected area is blown out or too white to be able to take any kind of readings from. So that's something to be in mind or keep in mind when you're doing your white balance adjustment. Now, usually when you are making white balance or taking white balance samples, you want to spot check several different areas and kind of go with the best balance option to your eye. So I can go over to the left eye here and just drag across it, and I can see that those colors change a little bit. That's a little better. So I'm looking at my temp and my tint numbers. That's around 20 and around 11 or 12. And I'll try this one. See, that one's about 19 and about 10. I like this one better. Okay, so now I've set my white balance and the temp and tint sliders have adjusted, and we can see that her skin looks just right. Her skin doesn't look, green or anything like that. One thing that I would keep in mind is when you are adjusting the tone on skin, try to keep away from adding any kind of green tone across it or blue, as that can make things look a little bit wonky. And I just so happen to have an example of that. So I'm going to go down and hit escape to go back to the grid view. And now I'm going to, here, we have a mixed lighting scenario. Okay, so this is more of a tough white balance situation. And we can see here in this portrait that we have a bunch of things that are going on here inside the face, because that's really, we don't have a neutral in this shot. What we have is whites of the eyes and we have some teeth. But we also have a color coming from this direction that is yellow or orange. And then we have another color from this direction coming in that has a teal tone to it. Now, remember that I said when you're talking about skin tones and you want to kind of stay away from the cyan or the green because it can make people look a little sick, we can almost, if you squint your eyes and imagine it, you can think about that here as you look at this shot. So my suggestion to a shot like this would be as follows. I would grab a hold of the white eyedropper and then try looking on the teeth, and you can see that actually isn't that bad if I look at it this way. And now we're removing all of the cyan from this side of the face when we might do this. So we're neutralizing it. We can also try the eye, and we can see that that neutralizes the skin pretty good. On the other eye, on the left side of the eye, we can see that that also does a pretty good job. But on the right side, we can see that cyan color comes back. Now, I don't particularly care for how bright that cyan gets, but I like it better when it's more blue when I go over here than I do when it's more green when I go in here. See, that green to me does not look natural in any sense of the word. So what we'll do is I'm splitting the difference here pretty much. I'm staying on the right side of this where you can see her eye color. If you look inside of the sample point where it's zoomed in, you can see that's a kind of a purple tone. And that looks good. So that's what I would do there. So now I'm going to hold down the backslash key so you can see the little adjustment that we made there to kind of increase that look on her face. Okay. So the background has become much more yellow after we made our white balance adjustment. And we're going to continue to make adjustments on this image now that we have this set, because it is kind of a tougher scenario. Okay. So now that we've talked about white balance and showed you a couple of examples of what to do and how to convert things to white balance, I'm going to suggest, laughingly, but I'm going to suggest that if you ever have a tough lighting scenario, not like this one where you use gels by design to give a look or a mood to an image, but if you have a scenario where you have a lot of different light conditions or different color temperatures in the lights and you can't find a good balance, you can always convert it to black and white, which will give you another level of control over the tones. Because once it's set to black and white, the color controls become the color sensitivity controls. And we talk about that and how to control that in the black and white editing videos and webinars on our website. So I'm going to switch it back to color. And we haven't really changed anything. We're still right where we were here. Okay. So let's move down to the color panel. And inside the color panel at the top is the color filter. Now, color filter is something that photographers use all the time. It is essentially a plastic or glass filter that you put over the end of your lens. Now, the reason I said that is that there's this preserve brightness checkbox. Now, once we apply, I'll choose one of these presets here. Okay, so see what the blue one is doing to that background? It just adds that blue cast, which gives a more orange or pink look to the background. It's actually really neat. So any of these that we choose will do something to the image, and it's just putting a subtle color tone across all of the images, okay? Now, we can control that with the density, or we can update where we want the color to be, or we can add any kind of cooling or warming to it, but this preserve brightness is what I wanted to point out. When you put a filter over the end of your lens, typically it cuts your exposure level as well, so you have to then, make up for that when you for your exposure. But anyway, we can preserve the brightness here because we're doing this in post, and it makes it a little bit easier for you to get the coloring without the darkening effect. So yeah, color filter like this is a quick and easy way that you can apply a coloring across the entire image, the whole shot. And we can click on the color chip here, and we can make adjustments to make, like if we wanted to make that blue darker, to give it more of a darker look, we could change this color around, make it more purple. And that's affecting our image back here. Okay, so if we want to use another type of, like if we're used to looking at another type of color spectrum, we can do that just like that. But anyway, okay. Now, we can make it more dense, which will give a stronger effect to the image, or we can crank it down so that it has less effect to the image. So that is a quick and easy way of putting a color, controlling a color tone on an image. So right now, I am complementing the teal coloring with this blue purple. You can see what it's doing there. Okay, so that's the color filter. Now, if we want to apply or change colors themselves, we would use the colors or the controls just below in the detailed adjustments section. And that's it. That is the hue, saturation, and luminance settings. We have a bunch of controls here that we can use to control colors themselves. So the hue category lets us shift each individual color of these 9 different colors that we have listed here. Wait, is that 9? 3, 6, 7, 8 different colors, like I said. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep. I'm good. I can count. Anyway, so we can grab each one of these individual sliders and make adjustments to the image's tones. And you can see right here where the her jacket or fur or whatever that is changing color because it's mostly in this reds channel. Also, the same thing can happen with the oranges. That's usually where people's skin tones are involved, is the oranges and reds. Sometimes also the yellows, so we can change those tones as well. You can see how the background changes as I drag this one. I can pull it more toward green if I go to the right and more toward orange if I go to the left. Now, I don't need to go down the list here and click individual sliders. I can also use the targeted adjustment tool, which is right here with the 2 arrows and the line in the middle. Click on that, and then I can grab a hold of tones in the image that in particular that I want to make adjustments to. So let's say this darker orangey brown tone down here, I can click it and then drag down if I want to change that tone, to add some more red to it, or up to do the same kind of thing. And you can see that the reds and oranges are changing when I do that. So I'm going to hit Command Z and undo that. Instead, I still have my targeted adjustment tool selected, so I can grab a hold of the skin, particularly on this blue, and I can make adjustments to it. So remember how I said I don't want it to look green? That's where I don't want. So I can drag that up a little bit to give it a little bit more of a purple or a blue, which gives it a little warm. If I add some more red into that and you make it more lavender, I feel like it tones it down a little bit more. So that's what I'll do there. So we can do the same thing with the saturation of each one of these tones just below. We can use the reds saturation to lower the saturation in that jacket if we think that it's kicking off that page too much, or raise it a little bit too if we want it to pop. Maybe we can give it a little bit of positive here. So now the adjustments that we make to these color controls on this panel, sometimes we want to make them very subtle. Okay, so as we're making adjustments, you can see that background gets really, double click to reset these guys. We can get that, see that background gets really saturated really quick. Or here we'll do it with the reds. Okay, so normally if we want to make some adjustments, we can do it right here with the sliders like I'm doing with the mouse. Another thing that we can do is we can click inside of it and we can use Shift and the arrow key. So I'm holding down Shift and I'm using the right arrow key to raise the saturation of the reds, or left and Shift to lower it, and that's by 10. So if I hold down Alt and do the same thing, I'm raising and lowering it. That's just one at a time. So there you go. Now, all I need to do to get to the next thing is I can click on the oranges. If I want to do the same thing, hold down Alt, I can raise the oranges saturation, and we can see it punching up here on her hair. That looks really cool. Okay. Okay, so at the bottom of the saturation, we also have controls for saturation in the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So we can raise and lower these depending on what we want the image to look like as well. And these are controls that actually you can't really find in other software, but it's really handy. Anyway, so what I was going to point out here was the midtones. For example, if we take those midtones and just take them down a touch, sometimes that's a great way to add more of an antique look, is by taking the saturations of the midtones down just a little bit. So I'm going to hold down the backslash key again. We can see our before and our after. Now, if I want to just shut off the coloring changes that I made on the color panel, I can switch off the color panel here with the blue toggle. So that's before we made changes on the color panel and after we made changes on the color panel. So you can see that it was very rich and very green, and then we've brought it back, we've toned it down, and we've given it a nice lavender look, and now we have a more peachy tone in the background. Okay, so luminance is the brightness values of each of these tones in the image. So same thing applies here. If we want to click on the targeted adjustment tool to make some adjustments, we can, and then we can grab a hold of something like the orange here. Oh, look what that does to her skin. Okay, so I'm not going to do that because that's not what I want. But a very subtle amount of darkening might not be a bad idea to give this chin the power of the chin, and the shadow underneath it in a portrait is something that I always look for. So I still want to have the skin have a nice sheen to it where it has like a shine, but then I still want to have this chin down here be defined. So there we go. That looks good. Okay. Now, what have we gone over? We've gone over all the HSL controls, and we also talked about how we can use the keyboard shortcuts to make some jumps as we're making adjustments to these things. Okay, so we talked about the color panel, so let's take a look at another image here, this one. Now there's a whole lot of yellow in this photo. So let's go. We made some other adjustments on some other panels. Let's look at the tone curve panel, because on the tone curve panel, we have a couple of other ways that we can make adjustments to colors in exposure. So one of the ways at the top of the tone curve panel here is the curve editor. Now, if you are familiar with using the curve editor, you'll be right at home. This is exactly how it is in most other curve editor, software that has a curve editor in it. We can choose what channel we want to make adjustments to here. Now these are the channels that you have. These correlate to the channels that you have in your camera. So the red, blue, and green channel, right? So we're going to go ahead and we can grab the red channel. And if we have, if we want to remove some of the red from the midtones in the shot, we can do that. And that will put the blue and green tones a little bit stronger in the shot. You can see how it affects this one as I drag it down. Now in reverse, if it doesn't have enough red to it, I can punch up the red, and that will leave the other two tones alone, and it will give it a little bit of a red tone. So that's a way to do that as well. Now if you do use the curve editor, but you're not quite 100% positive of what to do here, if you add a node like I did here, and you want to get rid of it, you just drag it off to get rid of that. Okay, so adding a new one, I'm just going to drag it down a touch. And I can choose back to RGB channel if I want to make any other adjustments like adding contrast, which you can see is done here with a dotted line. That's if I use the slider. Or I could use my own nodes here to put another contrast curve or reduce the contrast if I wanted to. but I'm going to skip that. Okay, so at the bottom of this panel is our split toning controls. And these are super handy at adding and controlling colors in the image. So split toning is, well, something that usually we hear about happening or taking place in black and white photos, but it's a great way to control images and tones in exposure. So I'm going to not choose one of the presets. Instead, there's a bunch of presets, as you can see. Instead, I'm just going to apply a color change here with some individual individual tweaks. So, okay, so this is how it works. If we look at the strip right here in the middle of the split toning panel, it goes from black on the left side to white on the right side. Now, that represents the values at which we are applying the color nodes or handles on the top. So, if it's all the way to the right, this yellow handle, then it's at the whitest values of the image, I'm going to be putting whatever the tone is here. So if I want to change that to say more red, then my red tone is going to be applied to the brightest areas of the photo. Right? So then I can change the strength, which tells me how much of that I'm going to put on the brightest values. Okay, so now let's think about mixing colors. I have red, I have a lot of yellow in here, and I want those to not necessarily like double up, like if I put yellow on it. But I also don't want to add like a blue, because that could make the skin tones, remember, we don't want to make skin tones look sickly. But if we did some sort of maybe a magenta tone, that could be interesting and make it look warm. So we'll turn the strength, we can make it however strong we want. I'm going to turn the strength down a little bit. And we can do the same thing here by moving this. Let me zoom back out. By moving this off of the end, we can apply it to the middle highlights or the midtones instead of right on the brightest area. And when I'm doing that, you can see how that changes subtly. Let me turn it up here so we can see it really easily. You can see how it changes where it's being applied. Now you see that it's on the bottom corner on the right, and when I drag it to the higher values, it's on the left. And I take it to the very top, it's just on the brightest tones in there, and that's kind of what I want. So I'm going to make it more purple and then take the strength way down. So the reason I'm doing purple is because what? Purple mixed with yellow makes neutral. All right, that brings us back to the middle. Okay, so let's go to the shadow, or the darker other one that's now on the dark tones in the image. This one, you can see that it's a darker tone. It's like a navy blue. So let's make that stronger so we can actually see it. Okay, so it was navy blue. I changed it. Blue. So it's really strong. We can see where it's going to affect the image. And when it's real strong, we can see where it's streaking here in her hair. We can see what's on the boot, and you can see how it's affecting the background on the side here. So at that point, we can take that strength and just add a little subtle bit of that tone there, which the mixture of this darker bluish purple and this warmer magenta-y purple is actually setting really nicely on this shot. All right, so there we go. Okay, so we talked about, let's run back over what we've done. We've talked about white balance and the proper way to check for white balance. We talked about how we can assign white balance in mixed light scenarios. We talked about how we can make adjustments on the color panel to images using the color filter, which applies a color across the whole shot, and how to control colors individually with the HSL controls down here on the bottom of that panel. And then we went into the tone curve panel. We went into the tone curve panel, and we talked about the curve editor and how we can do split toning. So with all of those things that we went over, we have a whole bunches of controls that we have to make adjustments to colors inside of exposure. And so with that said, that concludes our demonstration for this video today. So I'm going to give you a couple of comments, and then I'll shut down the recording, and then we'll take the Q&A and we'll go from there. So if you'd like to get in contact with other exposure users, I want to encourage you to get over to our Facebook group, the Exposure Users Group on Facebook. That's a great place where you can connect with other users, share images, share your editing tweaks and what you've done there, and connect with others and get inspired. If you want to post your work to Instagram, we'd love to see it. So we ask that you use our hashtag #MyExposureEdit, and that will bring it to our attention as well as the rest of the team. And I wanted to thank you for your interest in exposure.